After Apollo 12, NASA had gotten the idea of landing on flat plains, flat equatorial landings, down and dusted, landing at the ocean of storms and sea of tranquility. So for the next moon mission, NASA geologists select a more dangerous landing site because it's of more geological interest. The site they choose is the heavily cratered Fralmoro Highlands. Here, Apollo 13 would land. The commander for Apollo 13 is Jim Lovell, a veteran of 2 Gemini missions and Apollo 8. He's NASA's most experienced astronaut. One of the things that Jim said he wanted to do before he retired was to land on the moon. That was the reason why he had gone to NASA in the first place. That was the whole thing. So he was very much looking forward to Apollo 13. His crew were both rookie astronauts, Fred Hayes, and it was his lunar module pilot, and Ken Mattingly, his command module pilot. But Mattingly had to be scrubbed just 2 days before launch when he was exposed to German measles from astronaut Charlie Duke. So Ken Mattingly, in the role of command module pilot, had to be replaced by the backup CMP, Jack Swigert. And that's a testament to how great these backup crews were, because just 2 days before launch he could fulfill the role. He had the proper training for the mission down to come in and fly. So Apollo 13 lifted off at 1300 hours 13 minutes Central Time on April 11th, 1970, towards its mission at the Fralmoro Highlands. So, you know, this was the second day out after having grabbed the lunar module and gone out towards the moon, about 200,000 miles away from the Earth. They wanted to do a television program, broadcast live TV from the spaceship, so that people on Earth could see what it was like for them traveling to the moon. And of course this was the third mission to land on the moon, and so people were, you know, treating it as almost a routine thing, and they were starting to lose interest in landing on the moon, because it was not really anymore the romantics, it was now the science that was taking over in flying to the moon. We're starting to answer questions about how the moon came to be. That's very interesting for scientists, but for ordinary people who don't know a lot about it, there's not much for them there. So the signal from this television program went down to the Space Center and fed out to all 3 networks, but nobody carried it. It went as far as the Space Center, and that was it. So they don't want to tell the crew that, you know, no one's watching them. So the flight director just says up to them, do you want to cut the television program a little short? So Jim did. And then the crew prepares for 7 hours of sleep. Their last sleep before they enter lunar orbit. And just before they go to bed, Mission Control has one last routine request for Jack Swigert in their command module Odyssey to perform, to ensure its health while they're asleep. And one of the things that he asked, that the Mission Control asks Jack Swigert to do, is to stir the oxygen tanks. In the fuel cells, we use fuel cells filled with liquid oxygen to provide power and drinking water, to power for all our systems and water for them to drink. Now, we stir them, we turn on some fans to make them uniform, to get rid of the sediment that builds up, so that we can get accurate measurements of the amount of fuel we have. The problem was that there was a flaw in the fan, in that the rubber, which is supposed to protect it from scraping off the metal side of the fuel cell, had worn away. So when Jack Swigert hit the button to stir the oxygen tanks, spark was produced, and nothing happened for about 90 seconds. But as this spark was produced, this tank got hotter and hotter and hotter, and about 90 seconds after he pushed the button, when that tank overheated, it exploded. At this point, Jim Lovell was traversing the tunnel in between the command and lunar modules, and he just suddenly was thrown against the side of this tunnel and heard an almighty bang. Now, when that first fuel tank exploded, it sent a piece of shrapnel out that pierced the oxygen line in the second fuel tank. Apollo 13 has 3 fuel tanks, and in the command module, all 3 astronauts suddenly got to the command module, and Jack Swigert reports, "Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here." And it's call back and say again, please, 13. And then Jim Lovell calls up and says one of the most famous calls in NASA history. He says, "Houston, we've had a problem." And he was right. Because when the first fuel tank exploded, we didn't know that they'd exploded at this point. We just knew that we had had a shutdown of these fuel cells, and once you shut them down, you cannot start them up again in space. You can't land on the moon with one healthy fuel cell. So we knew very quickly that a landing on the moon was out of the question for Apollo 13. We need to get them home. And but of course, Mission Control, being a couple of 100,000 miles away, was a little bit slower in realizing just how serious Apollo 13's situation was, because this oxygen line had also caused serious damage to their life support system, and the command module Odyssey was dying, was starting to die. It maybe only had about 15 minutes of power left. We saw the oxygen system go to 0 and then come up the top and then go back down to 0 again. So for a lot of the time we thought it was instrumentation. It took us a while to figure out, oh my god, we need to get these guys out of that spaceship. So you're thinking, well, where can they go? What do we have? And of course we had the lunar module. The lunar module Aquarius was sitting right there. It was still a 100% healthy spacecraft. Using standard procedure, it should take lunar module pilot Fred Hayes 2 hours to power up the LEM. And he basically floated down the tunnel and started scoring out whole sections in his checklist and moved on. He needed to do it in 15 minutes, and he succeeded. And all 3 astronauts got down. But the lunar module is only designed to support 2 people for 2 days. It's going to take 5 days to get 3 astronauts back to Earth. So they need to start shutting down systems. And slowly the temperature went all the way down to 0 degrees Celsius. And conditions are pretty miserable for them for most of the flight. They can only keep a few heaters on to maintain their critical systems, and they get a little bit of heat out of that, but not very much. The conditions in the LEM are miserable. And after that, we had to figure out what to do. We know that we have no power left in the command module, which means we can't use the giant SPS rocket in the service module to basically turn these guys around and take them straight back home. That's out of the question because we use electricity to gimbal the propulsion system. So we have to use the far less powerful lunar module rocket to change their angle so that they would take them around what was called a free return trajectory. Charlie Duke and John Young worked on this problem so that we would bring them around the moon and come right back into Earth's atmosphere in the correct angle. Edgar Mitchell with others worked on the problem of using the lunar module as the prime propulsion vehicle, as the tugboat, working out how they could fly it manually without the autopilot because they had to turn it all off.